Hey podcaster, I'm Tim Alberg, your podcast performance coach with another actionable tip so you can grow your podcast authority, generate leads, and convert with ease. Today's tip is a podcast coach is only worth the money if you know how your podcast is going to make the money back. So the question of this episode is a podcast coach worth the money? Now, you might expect me to immediately say, yes, absolutely, everybody needs a podcast coach because, well, I'm a podcast coach. But the truth is, it really depends on what kind of podcast you have and why you're podcasting in the first place. A little while ago, we did an episode called 5 Types of Podcast Coaches and How to Pick the Right One. That's episode 245. If you want to go back and check it out, I will leave a link in the show notes for you. We did that episode because there were a lot of different reasons people hire podcast coaches, and not all of them are tied to business growth or ROI. In other words, is it worth the money is relative to your podcasting why. I talked about this back in episode 61. The link to that is in the show notes. It's called Why in the World Are You a Podcaster? If you're podcasting for your business, that's a real different reason to podcast compared to podcasting because you can't stay silent about the secret cat references in Star Wars any longer. The truth is, a podcast might not be worth the money if you are a hobby podcaster. At least not right away, because in the beginning, you can absolutely figure this stuff out on your own. You can learn as you go, improve over time, and slowly find your groove. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, if your time is valuable or really limited, and you'd rather fast track the learning curve so you can get to the fun part faster, then sure, a coach would be worth it. But that's a different conversation. Where this really changes is when your podcast is connected to your business. Now your podcast has a job to do. It's attached to your reputation, your authority, your marketing, and ultimately your revenue. Plus, wasting time is going to cost money. Getting it wrong could hurt your brand's reputation and your authority. This is when the answer to the question, is a podcast coach worth it, starts to lean more toward yes. But before you spend money on a podcast coach, you should probably ask yourself a very important question. How is this podcast going to make me money back? And I'm not talking about ads or sponsorships. We've talked before about how most podcasts being used as marketing tools are going to make far more money generating clients than they ever will reading ad spots. What I mean is, what role is the podcast going to play in your business? How is it going to support growth? Because if you can answer that clearly, then hiring a podcast coach is a much easier decision. And if you can't answer that, well, then hiring the right coach, one who will help you figure that out, is more likely to be worth the money. Let me give you an example of what a difference it can make. We had a client come to us with an idea of starting a podcast to mirror her recently released book. The podcast was meant to amplify what she'd already built and strengthen her authority around her expertise. A solid strategy, but not very trackable or directly tied to revenue generation. But she hired us and we were able to get a little more tactical about it. Instead of just creating a podcast to build her authority, we intentionally connected the podcast to her executive retreats and built the content around attracting and nurturing the exact audience for those retreats. The first retreat after the podcast launch, completely sold out. That's ROI. For each client, the ROI looks a little different. Sometimes it's clear and trackable funnels fed by the podcast. Sometimes it's systems and workflows that save them a huge amount of time every month. Sometimes it's the kind of authority that leads to speaking opportunities, consulting contracts, or coaching clients. But the common thread is that the podcast was built with intention. That's a lot easier to do with the right podcast coach. If you've heard this podcast before, then you probably already know that I offer a free podcast coaching call, and that means I get to speak with a lot of entrepreneurs. One of the things I hear all the time is that they've been thinking about starting a podcast for years. They've already bought the microphone, they've set up the room, maybe even recorded a trailer or two, maybe an episode, but they haven't actually launched. Usually it's because they're overwhelmed by all the moving parts. They don't know how to move from idea to execution, or they know that once they start, they need to keep going and that pressure keeps them stuck. That's where a coach can really help, not just by helping them launch faster, but by helping you launch with purpose, systems, and accountability. Because yes, you can absolutely learn all of this yourself. You can spend months researching equipment, trying different software, watching tutorials, experimenting with formats, figuring out editing and production, and eventually you'll probably get there. But there's a cost to that learning curve too, especially if your podcast is tied to your brand. And if the point of your podcast is to build authority and position yourself as an expert, then you probably don't want your first year sounding like you're figuring it out in public. You want to come out of the gate sounding aligned with the level of business you've already built. And honestly, this often comes down to time versus money. If you have more time than money, then maybe you don't need a podcast coach. But if your time has value and you want clarity, direction, accountability, and a straighter line between your podcast and business growth, then the right podcast coach can absolutely be worth the investment. The key words there being the right coach, because the right coach won't just help you launch a podcast. They'll help you build a podcast that actually serves your business. And I hope that's just the tip you need. If you're considering starting a podcast and trying to figure out whether a coach would actually give you a return on investment, book a call. Take me for a test drive. And yes, I still do private free podcast coaching calls, and it's super easy to book that call. Just hit the big orange button at podcastperformancecoach.com. Get on my calendar and we'll talk through your goals, the role podcasting could realistically play in your business, and whether getting support makes sense for where you are right now. Because the real question isn't just, is a podcast coach worth the money? It's, is your podcast idea designed to be worth the investment? Book your free private podcast coaching call by using the link in the show notes or the big orange button on podcastperformancecoach.com. I'm Tim Ulberg. See ya!